The Borg are Star Trek's most fearsome creation. Sorry Klingon, sorry Khan. Having conquered the franchise, if not the Alpha Quadrant, from Q1 to Q. Since the cybernetically enhanced species has sunk its tubules down so deep that you'd be excused for feeling at least a little assimilation weary, but even in their weakened last of the last generation, they still proved a formidable and thrilling enemy. Last is no doubt not the end either, and not just because there's another differently managed collective out there waiting at the gates. As we've seen before, only a handful of nanoprobes, or a few dozen drones, frozen or not, are needed for the Borg to begin again. The Borg are equally what differentiated Star Trek The Next Generation from its predecessor, with the assimilation of Jean-Luc having been the turning point. History will never forget the name Locutus. They've also become a veritable pop culture phenomenon in their own right. They're culture adapted to serve us all. Resistance has never been more expensive. However, despite the Borg's primary goal to get everywhere, reflected in their number of on-screen appearances over the years, our general knowledge of them remains fairly narrow. In other words, there's still a lot more left to assimilate. It would be prudent to set your phasers to a rotating modulation and take some of that neural suppressant the Doctor devised, just in case. The desire to know more needn't end with a cortical note. I'm Sean Ferrick for TrekCulture, and here are 10 things you didn't know about the Borg. Number 10. Electric entomology. Head writer, co-executive producer Maurice Hurley was firmly a part of the chaos and infighting that plagued the first 2 seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation. But you can't reproach the man for one thing. He pretty much invented the Borg. As quoted in the 50-year mission, the next 25 years, Hurley was unhappy with the waste of time Ferengi and so put his mind to concocting a new, properly menacing antagonist for the series. What he came up with was a literal race of insects, but that was far beyond the budget. Instead, Insect became Cyborg, a portmanteau of cybernetic and organism first used by Manfred E. Clynes and Nathan S. Kline in an article in the September 1960 issue of Astronautics. Cyborg then became Borg. Despite the changes, the now electrified species still held true to their entomological origins. As Hurley stated in the Captain's Logs, the unauthorized Complete Trek Voyages, the Borg are a variation of an insect mentality. They don't care, they have no mercy, no feelings towards you. They have their own agenda, and that's it. If all of them die getting there, they don't care. Of course, as the Borg were developed further, the insect association would be made more explicit through terms such as drone, hive mind, and not least in the introduction of the Borg Queen bee, or ant if you prefer, in Star Trek First Contact. Speaking of insects, number 9. Before the Borg, the butt bugs, and other schemers. Just when you thought it was safe to put down the mealworms and take off the fakery Dr. Crusher stuck to your neck, it's the bluegills, aka the butt bugs again. Given Maurice Hurley's original concept for the Borg, it is perhaps not surprising that, according to Michael and Denise Okuda in Star Trek Chronology, The History of the Future, in the early days of development, plans were hatched for the episode Conspiracy and the butt bug parasites therein to lead to the introduction of the Borg. There is little more known about the idea than that, and evidently the Bluegill-Borg connection was dropped before Q-Who. Moreover, if the buttbugs ever did end up meeting the Borg, who'd be assimilating whom? If that weren't enough nefariousness for you, let's bring in the Romulans. According to the Star Trek The Next Generation companion, The Neutral Zone, also written by Maurice Hurley, was originally intended to be the first of a multi-part story, which would have seen the Federation and the Romulans join forces to fight the Borg. There was a Writers' Guild strike at the time, however, so that story arc had to be abandoned, picked up, in a sense, 30-odd years later in Season 1 of Star Trek Picard. Number 8. Spandex Zombies. Star Trek The Next Generation Season 2 costume designer Dorinda Rice Wood, working in close collaboration with the makeup department, was given only 2 weeks to take her Borg outfits from design to reality for the drone's inaugural appearance in Q-Who. In creating the look, as she described it in Star Trek The Next Generation 365, Wood wanted to break away from the streamlined stainless steel concept of scary, taking inspiration from the work of Swiss artist H.R. Giger, famous for his biomechanical designs and not least for designing the xenomorph from Alien. As for the practical side of things, Wood created a system of various different molds and tubes that could be attached using Velcro, thank you Tamir, to a base suit made of a fabric called popcorn spandex, allowing for a degree of individuality in the Borg's mostly uniform appearance. The task of devising the Borg makeup for Q-Who went to makeup artist Michael Westmore. Westmore stated in The Next Generation 365 that in order to convince the audience that the Borg were beyond reason or negotiation, he gave the drones a zombie-like pallor, one that looked like the life had been leached out of them. Westmore and his son were also largely behind the changes made to the Borg's appearance in Star Trek First Contact, starting with removing the helmets. The subject of some speculation, and although direct inspiration is not suggested, Star Trek The Next Generation, the continuing mission, does point out that the Borg drone look was equally reminiscent of the cybernetic laser-eyed Lord Dread from the 1987 syndicated series Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future. Number 7. On the origin of cybernetic species by means of mechanical selection. In one form or another, the Borg have appeared so far in 52 episodes and one film of Star Trek. We have, in theory, seen the end of the OG collective in The Last Generation, but beyond their Delta Quadrant debuts and a smattering of Vaadwaur history, we still know little to nothing from canon about the Borg's beginnings. If you'll kindly hook up a tubule to the data node, we'll have to assimilate some beta canon instead. There's nothing natural in selection by the Borg, but they must have mechanically engineered their way up from something. One of the most recurrent origin stories for the Borg is tied to V'Ger. As noted in Star Trek chronology, Gene Roddenberry himself, after the production of Q-Who, even half-jokingly speculated that the planet encountered by Voyager in Star Trek the Motion Picture might have been the Borg homeworld. The V'Ger link is then used directly as the genesis of the Borg in the video game Star Trek Legacy and in the Shatnerverse novels. As we touched on in our Borg Queen video, the Star Trek Destiny book trilogy gives another exploration for the origins of the cybernetic superstars. In those, it is the catastrophic interaction between the usually friendly and technologically advanced Celiar and members of the crew of the NX-02, the bloody Makos, as well as a bit of time travel that leads to the birth of the Borg. Number 6. The God Particle. The creation story for the Borg is more down to earth and down to the writer's room than divinely inspired. As well as Maurice Hurley's insect-to-cyborg parable, the Borg mythos was also inspired by contemporary trends in science fiction in the 1980s, most notably the transhumanist philosophies of the then relatively new cyberpunk movement. As writer and story editor Melinda Snodgrass recalled in Captain's Logs, the unauthorized complete Trek voyages, the idea for the Borg was, in many ways, Maurice Hurley's, but it was she who brought up cyberpunk and augmented humanity. For the more transcendental, it would be difficult to argue that the Borg have a set of beliefs as much as they do a series of mandates, the loftiest of which is become perfect. That said, judging by 7 of 9's reaction to the stuff, the Omega molecule, particle 010, did seem to have an almost religious significance for the Borg. Omega was their infinitely complex yet harmonious Holy Grail. The Higgs boson is so 2013. Other than for the sheer perfection of it, and I doubt they'd turn their cybernetically enhanced noses up at the power boost, no further reasoning as to the Borg's obsession with Omega has been provided on screen. Each drone was instructed to assimilate the molecule at all costs, and several vessels and hundreds of thousands of drones were lost trying. In the Star Trek Destiny novel trilogy, this pre-programmed fascination is given an exploration. The Celiar, who eventually gave rise to the Borg, were a species who had harnessed Omega as a power source for their advanced technology. Unknowingly following its Celiar origins, Collective was willed to seek out the particle. Number 5. Collective Voice. I don't know how you do it. All those voices talking at once. Alternate future Admiral Janeway's jibe at the Borg Queen, not long before infecting her with just enough neurolytic pathogen to give Her Majesty the ultimate headache, raises an interesting question. Just how did they give voices to the Borg? In Q-Who, we not only saw the Borg for the first time, but we also heard them. According to Star Trek Communicator issue 147, the original idea for the Millions Speaking as One goes to sound editor Bill Wistrom and co-producer Mary Howard, who then figured out the layering technique to achieve it. What we do hear from the collective in the episode is the combined voices of director Rob Bauman, his assistant, and of writer Maurice Hurley. A similar method was used to synthesize the voice of the Borg in Star Trek First Contact. In that case, it was the work of actor and opera singer Jeff Coopwood, whose second audition for the role in front of director Jonathan Frakes was also, in essence, the take that made it to film. As Coopwood tells it, he got the job and spent the rest of the day listening to playback of his audition recording, repeating it as closely as possible to create about 20 slightly different takes. Each was then layered on top of the other, and 2 other actors were brought in to record the same lines to add texture. Coopwood's "Resistance is futile" then memorably echoed across subspace to the bridge of the Enterprise E. Number 4. Catchphrases and carbohydrates. Even Star Trek's most ruthless species still needs a good marketing slogan to really sell the assimilation to the still imperfect masses of the galaxy. From its first utterance in The Best of Both Worlds Part 1, the phrase "resistance is futile," and not to forget some of their other sayings, has become so ubiquitous that you don't need to have met the Borg to encounter it. Star Trek most definitely popularised the line, but in point of fact, "resistance is futile" and variations thereof has been used by characters in other TV shows long before Star Trek The Next Generation. For example, in the 1976 Doctor Who episode The Deadly Assassin, the Master says "resistance is futile," as does Maya in the 1977 episode The Dorkons of Space, 1999. Back in Star Trek the Motion Picture this time, Spock also gave us "any show of resistance would be futile, Captain." Of course, we, the audience, hear all of the familiar Borg spiel in Federation Standard. However, if the species has any kind of language to call its own, it is alphanumeric and algorithmic in nature. In The Raven, for example, B'Elanna Torres refers to 7 of 9's log entries written in Borg alphanumeric code. In its visual or written form, the use of the Borg language of sorts on screen dates back to the introduction of the Borg in Q Who. The graphic design was the work of Michael Okuda, who, in the Next Generation DVD Extra Alien Speak, explained the thought process behind it. It was supposed to be this all-encompassing web-like culture that would envelop people. I thought of it as a bowl of green spaghetti. You threw it on the floor and photographed that. Now we really know what the Borg were all along. Not perfection, but carbs. Number 3. Borg'd. In space, no one can hear you streamline. To that end, Maurice Hurley's original script for Q Who gave the following description of the purely pragmatic Borg ship as it first appeared on the Enterprise D view screen. It's box-like, with none of the aerodynamic qualities associated with most spaceships, including the Enterprise. This is a case of form following function. According to the Star Trek The Next Generation companion, to create what became the iconic Borg cube based on Hurley's imaginings, embellishments were added by designers Rick Sternbach and Richard James, and the task of building the studio model was then given to companies Starlight Effects, under the supervision of next-gen visual effects artists Dan Curry and Ron Moore. Along with the large studio model, which was also used in Emissary, a smaller model of the Borg cube was built for the explosive ending of The Best of Both Worlds Part 2. Much like the drones within it, the Borg cube had some work done for Star Trek First Contact. In an interview with First Contact DVD Extra Design Matrix, illustrator John Eaves reveals the evolution of his Borg ship designs for the film. At first more cuboid in shape, before evolving back into a cube proper. In general, the Borg cube in First Contact was more finely detailed and more compact than the television version, with the added component of the hatch for the Borg sphere. The model itself was built by Industrial Light and Magic. For Voyager, the switch was made to CGI models, including that of the tactical cube, which first appeared in Unimatrix Zero. Number 2. Geometric progression. The Borg's taste for geometric design continued in Star Trek First Contact with the introduction of the Borg sphere. In fact, Brannon Braga and Ronald D. Moore's first draft script had the sphere participating separately alongside a Borg cube and indeed Borg vessels plural in the battle with the Federation. Of course, in the version that made it to theatres, the sphere appears only briefly, rapidly dispatched by a volley of quantum torpedoes, its debris left hanging around for the 22nd century to deal with. Carry out what you followed in, Captain. When it came to creating the look of the Borg sphere for the movie, John Eaves, who also gave us the design of the Enterprise E, noted in the Design Matrix special feature that a point was made in particular to avoid any evocations of a certain celestial orb of doom from another franchise. Eaves even took the big Star Wars book to the producer's office to demonstrate that spheres were something big in the sci-fi world. Producers didn't seem overly concerned, however, but with Episode 1 already in the works, Eaves and team decided to distinguish their Borg sphere from the Death Star by creating a shape with deep facets that was more like sections of an apple cut with big open cores on either end. The Star Trek Deep Space Nine design legend Ricardo Delgado was also invited to submit proposals for First Contact, one of which, in Eve's words in Design Matrix, was a giant flying Washington Monument type ship, which was a very unique alternative to the Borg cube. Number 1. Two queens stand before me. The Borg Queen was never truly intended to be a singular, discrete entity. Her "you think in such three-dimensional terms" to Picard in Star Trek First Contact was evidence enough of that. Her Royal Highness has continued to pop back up even after dismemberment and death, and as we learnt from Star Trek Picard's second season, possessed a form of trans-temporal awareness, meaning that even queens and collectives from other universes had at least some sense of each other's existence. It is highly apt, therefore, that the Borg Queen in Picard's third season was actually two actresses in one, and that the "having spoken" of Locutus had been replaced by the voice of Vox standing before her. On set for the episode Vox and the Next Generation, it was Australian actress Jane Seymour who played the neurolytic pathogen deformed Queen, whilst the voice was provided by the original Borg monarch herself, Alice Krige. As Terry Matalas said to Will Wheaton during the Ready Room after show for The Last Generation, it had to be Alice. In an interview for Trek Movie, Picard makeup department head James McKinnon laid out some of the considerations that went into the look of the Seymour Krige Queen, which included how rotted is she after 20 or so years. Much like for the design of the very first Borg in Q Who, how much Giger plays into it. McKinnon also revealed that Seymour had to be glued into the set for the whole effect to work. Poor Jane, she was a trooper, Terry Matalas told Entertainment Weekly. And that's everything for our list today, folks, because I think anything more and we would be in danger of being assimilated ourselves. Thank you so much to Jack Keeley who wrote this article. You can find it over on whatculture.com. Please make sure that you are following us on the various socials. We are at TrekCulture. You will find us everywhere. How Borg-like. You are awesome, you are wonderful, you are brilliant. Live long and prosper, because resistance is futile. Thanks very much.